Chapter 7 will look at one of the most interesting aspects of development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. Of course, we're going to look at various aspects of family relationships. Our first video is going to focus primarily on the different relationships that exist for teens between them and their families. We will then, of course, discuss how those relationships change as we move into emerging adulthood. Our second video will look specifically at different approaches to parenting, and our third video will touch briefly on family situations that involve divorce and remarriage. To get started, I want to introduce a couple of key players in my family. This is my husband and my brother-in-laws. As you can see here, my youngest brother-in-law is currently a teenager. This picture was taken 2 years ago when he was, 14. He's now about to turn 16. So you'll get to enjoy multiple pictures throughout this lecture of the teenagers and siblings in my life. Before we get started, I want to focus on the theory that we like to use primarily when trying to understand the family. We like to think about the family as a system. The family systems approach understands functionality or overall happiness within a family as coming from multiple different relationships within the unit as a whole. These different relationships, when they experience change, will influence the overall family. Most families have at least 2 separate subsystems in there. Many families have more than that. For example, sibling relationships. Imagine you have a family like mine or my husband's with 3 siblings, 3 brothers. You have the sibling relationship that is comprised of the 3 boys' relationship with each other, but you also have separate systems for each individual pairing. My husband and his older brother, my husband and his younger brother. Those are each units. You often tend to see same-gendered parent-child relationships playing an important role, so a son and a father, but different gendered parent-child relationships also make up their own unit, so a son and a mother. Within a family, you oftentimes have married parents as well. That's its own unit. So the best way to think about the role that the family systems approach plays, or what this approach can help us conceptualize within a family, is to think about disequilibrium. Disequilibrium occurs anytime there's a change in one subsystem that causes the entire family to have to adjust. For example, when you have a child who reaches adolescence. Let's talk specifically about my brother-in-law. He's about to turn 16 in a couple months. When he turns 16, he will be able to drive. Lucky for him, we're going to be able to give him a car. That will introduce a lot of change to our family as a whole. So the change specifically for Jack, his name's Jack, turning 16, is going to cause a lot of trickle-down effects that impact the overall family system. My in-laws won't have to drive him around. They might have to spend more time worrying about where he is. I will, in a completely another state, be nervous every time I know he's driving somewhere, so on and so forth. You can also imagine that when Jack was born, being much younger than his older siblings, the birth of a sibling caused a big change in the family system as a whole. The parents were impacted, the brothers were impacted, there were new relationships forming, there was less sleep. My husband and his older brother as teenagers had to learn how to change diapers. Lots of disequilibrium. Most families experience disequilibrium pretty frequently, especially larger families that have multiple subsystems. But something as unrelated to the family system, or seemingly unrelated, as a parent getting a promotion at work or a child getting a bad grade at school can actually create disequilibrium that impacts the overall family system. So let's start by looking at the parents part of our family system here. Again, this is Jack, my brother-in-law, and my mother-in-law and my father-in-law. We know, just like with my in-laws, most parents tend to be in middle adulthood during their children's adolescent and emerging adult years. Middle adulthood is age 40 through 65. So even if you have parents who are quite a bit younger than average when they have children, they will most likely spend a good chunk of their children's adolescent years in middle adulthood. That introduces some interesting sources of disequilibrium in the parent's own life that can impact the adolescent or emerging adulthood. You might have heard of a midlife crisis before, where an individual in middle adulthood experiences a dramatic shift in their overall psychological well-being that might prompt them to change jobs or take up a new hobby or even sometimes get a divorce. Big changes like that, midlife crises, actually are not that common. In fact, most people discuss their middle years or their middle adult years as being the prime of their life. We tend to see very high levels of job satisfaction here, the highest level of financial security, and the most flexibility during middle adulthood. Most people have been in their careers for a long period of time. They're established. They're likely filling leadership roles. They likely have a good bit of job security. They've been saving up money. It tends to be an overall very positive time for parents in their own lives. So for most parent-parent dyads, a dyad is a set of two people, that specific unit, there tends to be less disequilibrium here for the family system as a whole. Now let's talk about siblings while we enjoy this picture of my husband and my older brother-in-law in their awkward teenage years when Jack was born. We know that about 80% of teenagers worldwide have at least one sibling. This number is higher in some countries, developing countries and some more traditional cultures, but having a sibling is the norm for most individuals, especially during adolescence and emerging adulthood. So that sibling relationship, that sibling unit, plays a very big role in determining the functionality or the functioning of the overall family system. Within each family, each sibling pair has their own unique relationship type. Those relationship types can look very different from one another. You can play a caregiver role, which was the case for my husband, my brother-in-law, and Jack growing up for most of his life, where you serve as an almost parental figure for the often younger child. That is not at all uncommon, especially in certain cultural groups where an older sibling is seen as having the responsibility to fill in that parent role. This is also common in families where you have a single parent, where an older sibling can help kind of offset some of that pressure. So serving as a caregiver to your sibling is not at all uncommon. Of course, many siblings also have buddy relationships where you have a friendship. Oftentimes you see a younger sibling trying to be like an older sibling when there's a buddy relationship. You can have something called a critical relationship where there's a very high level of conflict and or teasing, and that can put a lot of strain on the family system as a whole, as can having a rival relationship, a situation where siblings are often competing with one another. And then also not uncommon, although this might be hard for people who are very close to their siblings to imagine, some sibling pairs have a casual relationship where they're not necessarily emotionally intense or involved heavily with one another. One thing I want to point out here is that this is not a situation where you only can have one. Many siblings experience multiple different aspects of their relationship. Those different aspects can change throughout different periods of their life, or they can change on a day-to-day basis. So we want to look specifically at trends in sibling relationships during adolescence. We know that having a critical relationship, that high degree of conflict, tends to decline in adolescence compared to earlier years. However, it is still pretty common. So this does tend to be a period of less conflict between siblings, but more conflict between parents and teachers and other adults in the system itself. So we do not see a decline in conflict overall, just less between siblings. Most of that comes from siblings spending less time together. So critical relationships can involve things like teasing, calling names, making fun, arguing over possessions, someone wearing someone's shirt without asking, feeling that there's disequilibrium in responsibilities, where one sibling has more responsibilities than another, and they're unhappy about it. Oftentimes, sources of conflict during adolescence involve privacy being violated. That can be going in someone's room without asking. That can be listening at the door. That can be sharing private information to someone that a sibling doesn't want it shared to. And it often involves unequal treatment by parents as well. This is especially true during the adolescent years when you have a sibling slightly younger than an older teenage sibling. That older teenage sibling has been given more responsibilities because they're a little bit older. The younger sibling hasn't yet reached that level, and they feel that it's very unequal, when in fact they just need to mature a little bit to catch up with their older siblings. I'm sure many of these sources of conflict are familiar to a lot of us. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we often see multiple roles being filled within one sibling-sibling relationship. But regardless of that, we do tend to see relationships across the board becoming less intense and more casual. Again, this mostly is because of less time spent with siblings. So, a lot of siblings still view their closest age sibling as a buddy, as a friend, but they tend to identify them as being less close than their peers, friends they have with their peers. Moving into emerging adulthood, as we enjoy a slightly older picture of Jack and the other boys, we do see some interesting changes compared to adolescence. As you might imagine, most siblings become more distant from one another during the emerging adult years. That likely has to do with them moving away, moving out of the house, no longer living together in many cases. But even though we see more distance occurring, we do see a decline in conflict and rivalry, where, in fact, we see siblings reporting having a better understanding of one another. With maturity becomes a better understanding of the different perspectives and needs that your sibling has. So, even though we might not be as close as we once were, in many cases, we do understand our siblings better. The last topic I want to cover is extended family within the family system. While this might be something that many of you do not have an experience with, many families actually involve multiple generations living under one roof, or multi-generational households. This takes the family system and kind of spreads it out a little bit, where you have, as part of that immediate family system, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and even cousins, who all have their own subunits within the overall family system. Multi-generational households or families are more common in Mexican American, African American, and Asian American families. And within these families, we see some interesting effects of having multiple generations under one roof. For some of these families, it might not necessarily be that they all live together, but they tend to have closer relationships and even live in closer proximity to one another compared to other cultures. And when this happens, we tend to see, of course, closer relationships between individuals in the extended family, but we also see more support for the teenagers and emerging adults. They have more support, social support, emotional support, more guidance coming from their family. And because of that, we actually see fewer risk-taking or risky behaviors during the adolescent years. That brings me to the end of video 1. Video 2 will pick up by looking at parenting.